Welcome into Real Pod Wednesdays. I'm Dan Hope, joined as always by Andy Anders, and also joined this week by Garrick Hodge, our recruiting analyst slash national college football analyst slash photographer. Garrick holds a lot of hats for us over at 11 Warriors, but he is joining us today to talk about Ohio State's 2025 freshman class, because the National Signing Day as we know it actually happened in December. That's when Ohio State signed its entire 2025 recruiting class. Andy and I were, of course, busy talking about actual football games at the time. I think that the day signing day happened was also Ryan Day's first press conference after the Michigan game. And so I wouldn't say that recruiting was the top topic of discussion for us that day. We did cover it a little bit, but with today being the traditional National Signing Day, it's not going to be a busy day for Ohio State, at least on the signing players front. But for those who have followed recruiting for some time will remember that, up until a few years ago, this first Wednesday in February, rather, was National Signing Day. It was the day where all the schools signed all their recruits for the year. And so this used to be a really big day on our calendar, not so much anymore because that excitement has moved to December. But we thought it would be a good day to have Garrick on to talk about that class that Ohio State signed a couple months ago, and some of the players that we think are going to be stars from that class, as many of them have already started their Buckeyes careers, many of them enrolling at Ohio State last month. Many of them had the opportunity to be on the sidelines for those college football playoff games, and now they are, starting their career as first semester freshmen at Ohio State, getting ready to participate in spring practice, which we now know will start a couple weeks later than usual, but mid-March. So we're about 6 weeks away from spring ball as we sit here today, not starting the first week of March this year. We'll start after spring break as Ohio State looks to give its players a couple more weeks of rest after a 16-game season that ended in mid-January. If you're coming to us looking for coaching search talk, not going to get into too much of that today because everything's still so in flux. You will find on our YouTube channel, 11 Warriors, press coverage videos that Andy and I did over the weekend talking about both the departures of Justin Fry and Chip Kelly. We will certainly talk more about the coaching staff changes here on Real Pod Wednesdays after the new hires are made, but not a ton more than what we've already said right now as things remain in flux. We're sitting here recording on a Tuesday afternoon. We could say something today, and by the time you see this on Wednesday morning, something could have changed completely. So not a whole lot of sense in getting too deep into coaching search talk today. We'll see how all that unfolds here in the days to come. But to get to the discussion about the 2025 class, Garrick, I'll start with you as somebody who covers recruiting year round. As you look at this incoming class of freshmen, just what are your overall thoughts on the class?
Well, first, I was today years old when I realized that it's the actual signing day in February. I completely forgot about that because it's so irrelevant at this point, besides maybe like one or two. I think there was maybe one signing that I saw today publicly, and then I was like, oh, yeah, that is today, isn't it? Interesting. Okay. But to answer your question, Dan, I think that this class is pretty similar to some of the recent classes that we've seen for Ohio State produce over the past couple of recruiting cycles. They finish around 4 or 5 seemingly every year. And even we were kind of joking about it, before we started recording, it seems like Ohio State's recruiting cycle goes in waves every single year. Before we get to the spring, there's always kind of a, who are they going to get? There's only a couple commits in the cycle. And then spring and summer come, and then just they get a slew of commitments, and they look well-positioned to secure the number 1 recruiting class. Then things just kind of stall in the fall. Then there's some couple flips. Maybe they get a flip or two of their own, and they finish around 4 or 5. And, well, that's more or less where we ended up here today, is they're ranked number 5 in the country. I still think it's a very talented, very deep recruiting class. It's a little lacking on the offensive line in terms of elite caliber prospects. Not saying that there isn't one or two that could blossom into one of those eventually. But, there is some high profile misses that we've discussed ad nauseum over the past couple of years. David Sanders, anyone brings up his name, you automatically get PTSD around Columbus. But yeah, overall, I mean, there's some premier talent at the top. There's some developmental prospects that probably aren't being talked about a lot right now that could blossom into very talented players and contributors in the future. And overall, I think it's another great class that could be positioned to compete for a national championship again in a couple seasons.
It really does feel like deja vu every year with how the cycle seems to kind of go for Ohio State. You always have, kind of that bonkers run in the summer. And I remember having you on in the summer and we talked about it. And, I said, you kind of got me believing there for a little bit, that they were actually going to get the number one class last year. But I kept telling myself, like, don't buy into it. Like, we have this conversation every year. It never happens. Believe it when you see it. So I'm certainly going to remind myself of that going into this 2026 cycle. And we'll talk about 2026 for a few minutes at the end of the show. But to do a quick run through the class to refresh everybody on who Ohio State did sign in the 2025 class, 26 total high school recruits. This doesn't include any walk-ons that Ohio State will get. They did just get one earlier this week. Jason Gwynn, who's actually an Ohio State legacy, son of former Ohio State defensive back Anthony Gwynn and nephew of late former Ohio State defensive end Jason Gwynn. He'll be joining the quarterback room as a walk-on, but 26 scholarship players who signed Big Ten scholarship agreements with Ohio State back in December. Those are five-star quarterback Tavien St. Clair, running back trio of Anthony Turbo Rogers, Bo Jackson, and Isaiah West. 4 wide receivers, starting with five-star Quincy Porter, joined by Phillip Bell and Bodpegn Miller and Desi Jones. 2 tight end class of Nate Roberts and Brody Lennon. 3 offensive linemen, Carter Lowe, Javon McFadden, and Jake Cook. 2 defensive ends, Zion Grady and Epi Satanale. 3 defensive tackles, Jarquez Carter, Trajen Odom, Maxwell Roy. 3 linebackers, Riley Pettijohn, Tarvis Alford, and Eli Lee. 2 cornerbacks, 5-star Devin Sanchez, joined by Jordan Woods. And 3 safeties, Fahim Delane, Cody Haddad, Deshaun Stewart. Andy, when you hear that list of names, who are just a few guys who really jump out in your mind?
I mean, the 2 obvious ones are going to be the 5 stars, the big names, the Tavien St. Clair and Devin Sanchez, right? I mean, you talk about Tavien, the story of his recruiting journey, going from a guy who was, he had some attention as a quarterback, but really blossomed as a prospect later in his high school career. Didn't have that 5-star billing until really after Ohio State heavily involved. He commits, and he's a late riser in the recruiting world. And you look at the guy and his physical development over that time, and it makes a lot of sense because he went from looking, like this kind of gangly kid to now looks like a prototypical 5-star quarterback prospect. I mean, the dude is built like that caliber of player. And I think Devin Sanchez, Jeremiah Smith is a phenomenon unto his own. I'm not sure you're going to see many freshmen ever at any school come in and make that big an impact, be that big a start immediately year one. But I think Devin Sanchez at corner has some of that same. He could be a real contributor right away. Now, Ohio State's in a place at cornerback where he might not get that starting opportunity right away like Jeremiah did. But to me, I think Devin Sanchez is of that caliber where he could be too good to keep off the field year one. And that's saying something at corner, which tends to be a little more developmental than receiver, I think. So, those are the 2 names that I think you have to start with. But I want to say Fahim Delane, too, I think could even get involved in the safety competition. This was a great defensive backs haul for Ohio State, even with the lost name offered on signing day, early signing day. So I think those are the 3 players that top the list for me.
Yeah, you mentioned Devin Sanchez. It's going to be really interesting to see how that cornerback battle plays out because, you assume Davison Igbinosun and Jermaine Matthews are going to be those starters on the outside. But I do think, there's a chance that Devin Sanchez comes in and he's so good that they have to find a way to get him on the field right away. Maybe that's as the number 3 corner. Maybe that's moving one of those guys inside and somebody's playing nickel. We'll see how that ultimately plays out. But I do think he's certainly the guy who stands out when you look in this class of a guy who could force his way onto the field right away and play a major role as a freshman. I mean, we saw Denzel Burke do it 4 years ago. Now, granted, I don't think that cornerback room was as strong as this one will be going into 2025, but Devin Sanchez certainly has that kind of talent to be that kind of guy. Going back to Tavien St. Clair, I know, Garrick and I have both watched a lot of Tavien St. Clair. We've both been to his games. We've both seen him at camp after camp. Andy, I think you're in that boat as well, of seeing him at a lot of camps. And to Andy's point, this is a guy that it's been really cool to watch his development over the last 3 years. Because I remember the first time I saw him, I think it was at a 7-on-7 camp when I think he was going into his sophomore year of high school. And you could see that he had ability. You could see that the developmental traits were there, but he wasn't quite there yet. And you wondered, was he going to be one of those in-state quarterbacks who was good, but not quite Ohio State good? And then going into his junior year, which is when he got that Ohio State offer and ultimately committed to the Buckeyes, you could really start to see him maturing and becoming that Ohio State level quarterback. And then his senior, you saw him become one of the best quarterbacks in the country, where you saw, okay, this is a guy who looks like Ohio State's quarterback of a future. Now, he's coming in at Ohio State at an interesting time because Ohio State is going to have a quarterback competition this year. Tavien St. Clair's going to be a part of that quarterback competition. I don't think he's going to be the starting quarterback as a freshman. I think Julian Sayin is going to be the front runner in that competition, but it's going to be interesting to see how quickly Tavien St. Clair can make a push there. Now, I think one of the challenges is it's a big jump from Bellefontaine to Ohio State. He wasn't playing the most elite competition in high school. So I think there's going to be an adjustment there. But I think one thing that's going to really help Tavien is this guy's been around Ohio State a lot. I mean, it almost felt like he was already part of a team the last 2 years because he was at every game. You go to spring practice, he's always there. So he's got a ton of familiarity with this Ohio State program, and you'd think that's going to make for a really smooth transition for him this spring.
Yeah, I've gone back and forth a lot on how fast Tavien could ascend or compete for the starting quarterback, and I've always tried to be a lot more cautious than most people about expectations for five-star players because fans naturally get excited because they're these naturally talented kids that are so athletically gifted that have dominated any time they've ever touched the field, and it looks like they can't be beat. And then, they get around their peers, and even some of them have admitted privately, man, I thought I was really good, but then I got around a bunch of other guys that are really good and realized they had to work a little bit harder. And I don't think, Tavien may necessarily have that moment, but like you said, Dan, the last game he played was in Division IV Ohio high school football. And not that I don't think Tavien is going to be a very good player one day, but asking him to go from that to playing Texas August 30th is a very, very tough ask. It's just night and day. That would be like, I don't want to go too far off the deep end on hypotheticals, but there's a lot you could do with that if we had a lot more time on this podcast. But no, I mean, if Tavien is in the running to be your starter August 30th, that means one of two things have happened. One is amazing and one is a disaster. One is that Tavien has far surpassed any coaches and fans' expectations and has learned the system and is just delivering dime after dime in practice. And he's performed so well that it would be a disservice and an insult to the locker room not to play him. The other is that either Julian Sayin or Lincoln Kingholz is hurt or severely underperforming, and they feel that their best chance is that they have to throw a freshman in there that may not have the full grasp of the offensive system, whatever offense they're going to run. We don't know what, the coordinator, even though we have a grasp of Ryan Day's offense by now. But, that they don't trust Julian Sayin or Lincoln enough, or one of the two of them is hurt, and then they have to put Tavien in there against Texas. So I would be surprised, to put it bluntly, if Tavien is actually under center, but I guess it's not out of the realm of possibility he could be on the 2 deep by the end of the year. I mean, Julian Sayin got on 3 deep before the end of the year was over, and some were arguing that he should have been the backup behind Will Howard. So it's not out of the realm of possibility, especially when you don't have an established starter and a quarterback that has not started a single college football game before. And like you said, Dan, we all expect Julian Sayin to be the front runner. Well, we don't know. We won't know until he's getting reps with the ones consistently, what that looks like, what Lincoln looks like when he takes the ones. And then, hey, maybe Tavien's far more advanced and Division IV football is a lot more competitive than I think he is, and he just blows us all away. It's one of the more fascinating spring football quarterback competitions I can remember in a couple years, but I'm just excited to see how it plays out.
You make a very good point about the jump from Bellefontaine to starting against Texas in week 1. That would be quite a big jump. So I agree with you. I mean, I think the ideal scenario for Ohio State is you hope Julian Sayin is what you think he is. He becomes a star for the next 2 years. He goes off to the NFL. And then you have Tavien St. Clair with 2 years of development who's ready to be that next guy up. I think if everything goes according to plan, that's probably the trajectory of what Ohio State's quarterback room is going to look like over the next 3 to 4 years. But I think, regardless of what his role is this year, I think Tavien St. Clair is a guy who's just an awesome addition to this room, because you're talking about a guy who's all in as a Buckeye. I mean, we were talking off air before about how much recruiting has changed these days, and it's very different than it used to be, and it's not as much about relationships anymore as it is about NIL and all that. But you talk about a guy was just all in being a Buckeye from day one, who is coming to Ohio State because he loves Ohio State. Tavien St. Clair is right at the top of that list, and I think that makes him the perfect guy to come into this quarterback room, develop over the next year or two, and then hopefully become, that next star quarterback in the room, after, Julian Sayin, Lincoln Kienholz, whoever ends up leading the Ohio State quarterback room this year. And really, Devin Sanchez had a lot of that as well. I mean, Devin Sanchez, this was a guy who loves Tim Walton. His family loves Tim Walton. That was a big reason why he came to Ohio State as well. So certainly, I'm sure both those guys are being well compensated on the NIL front. But those are two guys who relationships really did matter for those two guys in terms of becoming Buckeyes. Those guys, 2 of the 3 5-star recruits in this class. Quincy Porter, a guy who I feel like kind of flew under the radar his entire recruitment, but he actually ended up becoming a 5-star late in the cycle, had a really good performance at the All-American Bowl that boosted his final rankings. And I think he's a guy, it hasn't gotten Jeremiah Smith level attention, as Andy said, few do. I think even compared to other recent 5-star wide receivers in that room, he's been a little bit overlooked, but another guy who's bringing elite talent to an Ohio State wide receiver room that's going to be full of it once again in 2025. I mean, you're going to have 3 5-star recruits in that room, and Jeremiah Smith, Brandon Inniss, and Quincy Porter. Another guy who probably should have been, or actually 4, Mylan Graham in there as well. Another guy who probably should have been in Carnell Tate. Another guy they really like in Bryson Rogers. So, Quincy Porter, a guy they're probably not going to need him to play a lot as a freshman the way Jeremiah Smith did, but certainly a guy that I think is going to push for a spot on that 2 deep right away with the talent that he's bringing in to Ohio State. Andy already mentioned Fahim Delane as a guy he really likes. Garrick, who's a guy who wasn't a 5-star that you really like, that you think is going to end up being a star out of this class?
I think I'm going to go with Zion Grady, and I'm kind of calling my shot here because he's kind of one of my sleepers to be on the 2 deep right away as a freshman. And I think because, of course, Ohio State would have loved to hold on to the commitments of Zahir Mathis and London Merritt. They would have loved to retain them, obviously, but college football being what it is, it got to a point to where they weren't comfortable going with other opportunities that they had, if you catch my drift. But Zion Grady was a guy they did not want to lose because they really believed that, like, with his current build, he'd be able to compete right away. And I don't think that they were set on that with Zahir in London. So I think that I could kind of see Zion Grady being like what Edric Houston kind of was this year, maybe not a guy that starts right away, but gets more and more playing time as the year goes on. I expect him to probably stick at defensive end. We'll see where it goes. But, I'm like I'm sure you and Andy are, Dan. I'm high on Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson Jr. too, but, they haven't started in their college careers, even though they've played a lot of meaningful snaps. So a lot of snaps at the edge open for grabs this year, and I'm pretty excited to see what Zion Grady can do. I'm projecting he'll probably be on the 2 deep by the end of the year, probably kind of play in that role that Caden and Kenyatta played the first couple of years and get some snaps in meaningful situations, even though he's not necessarily a full-time starter. And then by year 2 or year 3, I expect him to kind of take that leap and become a pretty good player for Ohio State.
I think another guy for me, and not going out on a huge limb here, because he was a 5-star at one point, ended up finishing, just below 5 stars, a high 4-star, but Riley Pettijohn, I think, is a guy who has all the tools to be an excellent linebacker for the Buckeyes. You think about the future of a middle linebacker position for the Buckeyes. Arvell Reese probably going to be the next man up there this upcoming season, replacing Cody Simon. But I think Riley Pettijohn's a guy that can develop behind Arvell Reese over the next year or two and become a really good middle linebacker for the Buckeyes. So I think he's a guy who really has all the traits you look for in that middle linebacker position. And I think he's a guy that, by the end of his career is going to be a fantastic leader for that Ohio State defense and a very productive tackler in the middle of the defense there. Andy, anyone else who really jumps out to you that you want to highlight?
Oh, I got to talk about an offensive lineman. So I think Carter Lowe has an amazing physical build for the offensive tackle position. And it's going to take a year or two for him to get there. It does for most offensive linemen. It's one of the rarest positions to come in and make that impact right away. But I think Carter Lowe, when he does develop, is going to be a really, really good player in this offense. It's, offensive line recruits, like you talk about, Justin Fry's misses over the time of his Ohio State career and part of why he's off to the NFL maybe. But, this is one of the successes, and he's landed a couple good in-state prospects, be Luke Montgomery being another who we saw make an impact in the playoff run. I think Carter Lowe brings a lot of things to the table to be excited about at offensive tackle with that length, that build, that athleticism. And then he's a guy that I'll be watching closely his Ohio State career for sure.
We talked about it. I think we'd probably all agree that, out of all these guys, the guy who's probably the most likely to play a major role as a freshman as Devin Sanchez. As Andy mentioned, Fahim Delane, a guy who could certainly factor in the safety competition. I think Riley Pettijohn's a guy who could certainly contend for a spot on the 2-deep quickly at linebacker. Zion Grady, as Garrick mentioned, I think there's certainly opportunity there at defensive end. Quincy Porter, again, I don't know how many snaps are going to be available to him as a freshman at receiver, but certainly I think a candidate for the 2-deep. I think another position group you would circle as there being an opportunity to play as a freshman is at running back, because the only returning running back on scholarship for the Buckeyes is James Peoples. They brought in C.J. Donaldson from West Virginia, and you expect that those two guys are probably going to take the bulk of the carries this upcoming season, but those guys also aren't Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. And so, at least not yet in terms of James Peoples. So I think the opportunity's there for a third guy to potentially push for more carries than we saw James Peoples get as a freshman. Garrick, as somebody who's covered these guys, is there one of those 3 running backs in particular who stands out to you as someone who you think could push for playing time as a freshman?
Yeah, I think both Bo Jackson and Turbo Anthony Rogers could. I would probably go and say Bo Jackson outright, but I'm a little hesitant to do so because he suffered a season-ending knee injury pretty early in his high school senior season. I did talk to Carlos Lachlan at the Rose Bowl Media Day, and he said that Bo should be good to go and have no restrictions in the spring. And I'm going to take him at his word. So I'm just going to, let's say for the sake of argument, that's true. But Bo's a very explosive runner, and, if he's the same after the knee injury or whatever season-ending injury it was, I think that he could be a very great player for Ohio State and a very explosive player that could fill the James Peoples role this year. Or if maybe James doesn't take that next step that we all expect him to, maybe Bo slots in as that number 2 running back behind Donaldson. But I think Turbo is kind of interesting because you can put him in a lot of different spots. One of Dan's favorite Buckeyes that he's covered, I'm sure, is Xavier Johnson. And Anthony Rogers kind of fits that same role where I think you can put him in the slot, you can put him in the backfield, you can have him run reverses. He's used to doing that all the time for his high school. In high school, he played a lot of receiver, he played a lot of running back. A term that Dan hates with all his heart is Swiss Army knife, and he stabs us in the heart every time we write it in an article. Just kidding. But that's a fair description of him because he wears a lot of different hats and he moves a lot of different places around the field. And when you have a guy like that that has the athleticism and quickness, and he's not a very tall guy, he's around 5'9", 5'10", somewhere around there. But when you have a guy that's that explosive and can play so many different places, it kind of makes you wonder, like, well, if he can do a lot of different things, and you have to think that they're going to get him on the field at some point if he's got the goods, right? So between Bo Jackson and Anthony Rogers, I wouldn't be surprised if at least one of those emerges as a pretty significant player for Ohio State in 2025.
Yeah, we're talking about snaps at running back and C.J. Donaldson. We mentioned defensive end earlier and the snaps that could be up for grab, and I think Logan George is also in that conversation. Garrick, I was going to ask how you feel this transfer portal class has supplemented what Ohio State did in the recruiting trail, because obviously that's a huge part of the modern era of college football. The offensive lineman that they brought in, Max Clair, I feel like is a huge add in the tight end room. Just get your thoughts on the transfer portal there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Andy. I think that the two offensive linemen they brought in via the transfer portal helps really mitigate maybe the low numbers on the offensive line, as you suggested, and especially since both of them are front runners to start at each tackle position between Ethan and Phillip. I think, a lot of scouts are very high on Ethan in particular with only 1 year eligibility, that he may be one of the better left tackles in the country. And that's pretty good considering that, again, we're going to keep harping on it for the next couple months, but you play Texas that has one of the best pass rushers in the nation coming at you week 1. So you'd like to have a little bit of stability there on both tackles since both of them are gone after this season. But Phillip's a little bit more on the raw side coming from Minnesota. Started the Gophers' last 4 games. Will have 3 years remaining. The cousin of Paris Johnson, I believe. And all the potential in the world. Guy was made to be a Buckeye. Grew up a Buckeye fan. And so, once got in the transfer portal and heard Ohio State was interested, it was a pretty short recruitment from there. But that's only part of the puzzle. Like Max Clair, I think, is a legit receiving weapon. We talk about all these other guys that Ohio State has, the Cardinal Tates, the Jeremiah Smith, of course, Brandon Ennis, all these guys. But Max Clair had 600-something yards on one of the worst Big Ten teams I've ever seen in my life. It's like this guy is a fantastic talent over the middle and is going to just make linebackers' lives miserable, especially if whoever the new offensive coordinator is utilizes him properly. Logan George is a guy that's kind of hard to put a gauge on because, he played at such a small school. It's hard to get a real measuring stick on how he's going to step up against, guys that are on his level. But like you said, he's going to be in that competition for defensive end. And yeah, C.J. Donaldson, like you mentioned, Andy, big bruising running back from West Virginia. Carlos Lachlan was really excited about him when we spoke. I think that James Peoples was also really excited about him when I talked to him before the national championship. And I think in particular, he has a very bruising style running technique, and James is more the sleeker kind of side, even though he's also capable of putting a hurting on someone. And I think their running styles complement each other very well. I think when you get down to the goal line, you're going to see a lot of CJ. He's going to be the guy that's going to punch it in a lot in short yardage situations. So they will have a lot of options to hurt you in the backfield for sure. But overall, to answer your question, this transfer portal class is pretty good to patch their holes, if you will.
When we think about long-term prospects in this 2025 class, you just talked about Max Clair. I think another tight end coming in that I'm really intrigued by is Nate Roberts. I think he's a guy who's maybe more college ready than a lot of tight ends are coming in. Now, I don't think he's going to play a lot as a freshman because they added Max Clair. They have Will Merritt coming back. They have Bennett Christian coming back. They have Jelani Furman coming back. So a lot of depth there at tight end. Don't necessarily need either Nate Roberts or Brody Lennon to play much as a freshman, but he's a guy I'm really intrigued to watch his development. I think he has all the tools, year 2, year 3, to be a guy who really emerges as an excellent tight end for the Buckeyes. I'll go to you two guys, starting with you, Garrick. Who's a guy in this class we haven't talked much about yet, who you think is going to really proved to be a gem in this class.
How far do I really want to call my shot here? Screw it. I'll have some fun. We'll go with Bodpegn Miller, just because the camp that I saw him at, the guy's too good of an athlete not to be good somewhere. For those that don't know, Bodpegn was a high school quarterback his entire football career. This 6'4" guy that appears out of nowhere at Ohio State recruiting camp. None of us really have him on our radar. And the guy works out at receiver with Brian Hartline and just kind of blows Hartline away. I remember Hartline kind of walking in to go evaluate kind of what he just seen at the first camp Bodpegn did. And he was really just kind of talking to himself like, man, I really want to offer this kid. But I don't think he was planning on it. And he's like, I got to see this kid again. And then he saw him again, and he's like, screw it. I'm offering this kid. And sure enough, like, you just watch him compete in the 7-on-7 like we all did. And, I mean, for a guy that's only been playing wide receiver for 4 months, I just want to know how much better he's going to be in 4 years. So it's a very developmental call your shot, and he's not going to be on the field anytime soon, for sure. He's very raw to the position, has a lot to learn. But I think this could be a guy that in maybe 7 years from now, you're like, wow, what a fun story this was.
For me, and sticking with the big boys here, I think defensive tackle, we haven't really talked about this position much. And, Jarkais Carter might be the highest rated of that group. To me, I think Trajen Odom is pretty intriguing. I think the length that he has at 6'4", and when you talk about a guy that's already 285 pounds, or at least listed as that on 24/7, in his recruiting profile, he's a guy that you add weight to that kind of long frame, and you can get a lot of stuff done on the defensive line. And to me, too, he's ranked outside the top 400 in the composite, but I always like to put more stock into who's offering a kid, right? Especially when you're talking about a 4-star, 3-star in that sort of range. And he's got a guy had offers from USC, took a visit there, Oregon took a visit there, Alabama, a lot of powers in college football. Georgia offered. Like, this is a guy who had a lot of national recruiting attention, even if he wasn't as highly ranked. And again, I think with that length size combo, he could bring a lot of intriguing things to the 3-tech position when you talk about having the ability to extend on an offensive guard and get that separation to shed a block and make plays in the running game. Long arms are very helpful, obviously, for pass rushing. So to me, Trajen Odom is one that I think might be a little slept on as far as this defensive line haul goes.
I will say, I think out of all the players in this class, probably the one that I'm personally rooting for the most to be that hidden gem is Bodpegn Miller, because he just has such a cool story. I believe Ethiopia is where he was born and was adopted, came over to America. And then, as Garrick talked about, he's been a high school quarterback his entire career. Brian Hartline, I mean, you're talking about a program that has its pick of a litter at wide receiver pretty much every year, because Brian Hartline's got such a great reputation. So many top wide receivers want to come to Ohio State and be a part of his program. And Brian Hartline makes a bet on a guy who doesn't even play wide receiver in high school because he sees these traits I think a guy who, everybody you talk to is just a really high character kid, somebody who I think is going to probably be a future leader of the program with just the kind of qualities that he brings in. And so certainly a guy who qualifies as a project for Ohio State because of his inexperience playing the wide receiver position. But with a couple years of development, if he stays the course, I'm really intrigued to see the kind of player he becomes. And I agree with Garrick, but I think he's a player who in the long run could very well prove to be a hidden gem of this class for the Buckeyes. Lots of talk there about the 2025 class. Before we wrap up today's show, also want to get Garrick's thoughts here on the 2026 class, because now that the 2025 class is signed, of course, the 2026 class now becomes the priority for Ohio State in recruiting. And the Buckeyes currently have just 4 commits for 2026, those being 5-star wide receiver Chris Henry Jr., headlining the class, along with cornerback Jacob Weatherspoon, tight end Corbin Fordham, and wide receiver Jaden Ricketts. As we talked about at the beginning of the show, not necessarily a big cause for alarm, but Ohio State only has 4 commits so far because these things tend to happen in similar cycles. You're most likely going to see a lot more activity in terms of commitments after spring practices start, and then especially in that June-July window after official visits. So, Garrick, as you start looking ahead to the spring and summer, who are some of the top names that Ohio State fans should know about? Who are some of the guys that you think could be on commitment watch when that time comes?
Well, I can tell you I'd feel a lot more confident in this answer if Justin Fry hadn't left to go be the Arizona Cardinals offensive line coach. But whatever. It's a state of the industry, and we all have to adjust as such. I still think Maxwell Riley's on commitment watch in the spring. I mean, when you're openly down to 2 schools, Ohio State and Clemson, you're pretty close to pulling the trigger, right? He probably could have made a decision this month or at the latest early next month. He might take a little longer than that now because obviously he's going to want to develop a relationship with Ohio State's new offensive line coach, whoever that may be, and kind of feel that out before he probably makes a decision about his future. But Sam Greer's another offensive lineman I feel pretty good about for Ohio State. I think Adam Guthrie is also another guy, in-state guy, that is very high on their list. But like Max, Clemson's going to be a very tough competition for them there. I don't think he's on commitment watch this spring, but I really feel good about Micah Champ-Smith, mostly because he's an out-of-state O-lineman, and Ohio State has to get one of these premier out-of-state O-linemen one of these years, and he might as well be in-state with how often he's visited Columbus over the past year, even though he had a very good relationship with Justin Fry. But let's see, Albert Hill's a guy that could pop at any time, a 5-star cornerback, Ohio kid. But again, a lot of big players want him too, and you're going to hear the name Oregon a lot, and it's going to be really annoying over the next couple cycles with Phil Knight money. So anytime Ohio State wants a player and it's a high caliber player, there's a good chance they're going to be battling Oregon for his commitment. So I said a lot of O-linemen there, which makes not a whole lot of sense because, they don't have an offensive line coach right now. But before Justin Fry left, that was kind of where I was leaning toward for guys wrapping up their minds pretty quickly. So I guess maybe somewhere in there, if they establish a connection with the new Ohio State offensive line coach. But Albert Hill could be a guy that has said that he might pull the trigger before it gets to official visit season 2. So I don't think it's out of the question that Albert Hill could commit to Ohio State or somewhere else by the end of the spring.
You talked about the offensive line. Obviously, that's been a priority the last several cycles for Ohio State. It seems that we have this conversation kind of entering every recruiting cycle of, they need to hit on some big offensive linemen, and then they don't get as many as they were hoping for, and then we're right back at this starting point. But what are some other positions you feel like that are going to be a priority to address going forward in this 2026 cycle for the Buckeyes?
I don't know if I'd call this one a priority, but it's definitely really interesting to me to see what they do, and that's quarterback, because Ohio State's in a very peculiar position with quarterback recruiting for 2026 because we've talked about Tavien St. Clair a lot. Julian Sain's also a young guy to where if he's good, he's going to be your starter for 2 years, and then if Tavien's good, he's the natural successor there. So that's a 3-year plan. Plus, Brady Edmonds is a 5-star caliber guy in 2027 that's already committed. So it's a pretty crowded room already on paper. But Ohio State still wants a big fish. Jared Curtis decommitted from Georgia. I would probably take the field over Ohio State for him right now, even though he's been very complimentary of Ohio State in a couple of interviews. But there's a couple different variety of ways that could go there. They've offered 3 new guys over the past week. Bo Bentley out of Texas is an interesting prospect just off the top of my head. That could be one. So yeah, I'm kind of interested to see what they do at quarterback. And I mean, there's a couple others too, right? Tight end is a position that Keenan Bailey is just going to take 2 tight ends until they can't anymore. It used to be, Dan and Andy are old enough to remember when Ohio State would just take one tight end to cycle, and then all of a sudden that would just be it, no matter how many times they've tried to add two. And now they can't stop adding two to recruiting cycles. So they've already added Corbin Fordhams, who I think is going to be a pretty good all-around tight end. But I think they're going to take another shot at tight end. And, offensive line is the obvious answer to this one, but I already went on a launch spiel about them. So defensively,
I mean, you got to get some numbers on the line, I think, especially at defensive end, because with Curry and Jackson does have an extra year of eligibility, but I think they're going to need to replenish those defensive end numbers.
Yeah, I mean, basically the trenches. You can't, right? Tackle depth, defensive end, and I'd also argue make a strength to strength at cornerback. Like they may have a variety of wealth options if they land Albert Hill. That a Victor Singleton, a top 70 prospect that's right in your backyard, goes to Illinois. And while maybe it would have been nice to have him, you may not miss him a whole lot if you get an Albert Hill and a Jacob Weatherspoon spark to your cornerback room for 2026. So there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of dartboards out there, and we'll probably learn a lot more of what specific players they're targeting in the spring once we get a complete coaching staff, because that probably has a lot of part of it too. To what's the defensive coordinator going to emphasize? What's the offensive coordinator going to really try to implement in Ryan Day's scheme? And of course, the offensive line coach is probably going to have a lot of input on the offensive lineman that he's going to want in his room. So it's fun to guess about it right now, but we're probably going to have a lot more clarity on that in particular in a couple weeks.
Yeah, the quarterback situation is interesting because, if you think back to a weekend ago, Chip Kelly goes out and visits Brady Smigel, or I think that's how you pronounce it. He goes out and visits him. Brady decommits the next day, and you're thinking like, oh, this is a good sign for Ohio State. Mm-hmm. And now Chip Kelly's off to the NFL. So obviously, much like you talked about the offensive line, quarterback situation is going to depend some on filling out the rest of his offensive staff and, building those relationships with the staff. But that 2026 class, it honestly kind of reminds me of a few years ago when Quinn Ewers had been committed for the following year. And it was kind of like, it was just going to be hard to get that top guy in that class because guys saw the writing on the wall of it's going to be tough for me to come in here and win the starting job. And I think they're kind of in that same boat with 2026. Now, we obviously saw what happened with Quinn Ewers. He reclassifies, leaves after a year. So the best laid plans don't always work out the way you want. So that's why you still got to go after Jared Curtis. You got to go after Brady Smigel. You got to go after these top quarterbacks because you always want to have contingency plans, because as much as we might think, hey, Julian Sainz is going to be great for 2 years, and then Tavien St. Clair is going to be great for a year or two, and then Brady Evans is going to be up next. Especially in today's world of college football with the transfer portal, so many different things can happen that even if they seem unlikely to change right now, there's so many different things that can happen from 1 year to the next that you got to keep, taking bites at that apple. You got to try to build elite recruiting classes every year because you never know what's going to happen from 1 year to the next. And so that's certainly going to be the goal in 2026. As we discussed, 2025, maybe not a perfect recruiting cycle for Ohio State. Certainly they had that goal of, finishing with a number one recruiting class. They're disappointed that they didn't get guys like David Sanders Jr. and Naeem Offord, but still a lot of exciting talent in that class that we're certainly going to be excited to watch when spring practice begins, and then going into not just the 2025 season, but the entirety of their Ohio State careers. And so, Garrick, we appreciate you joining us on today's show to help break it down. As always, we'll have a lot more to come on 11warriors.com, especially as we continue to follow the coaching search. As Ryan Day ultimately makes decisions to fill out his staff. We'll have lots of coverage of that to come over on 11warriors.com and on 11 Warriors YouTube channel as well. So we thank you for joining us once again for another episode of Real Pod Wednesdays, and we'll catch you next time.